Episode 1, A Child of Shadows and Steel Scotland, 1270s. A boy is born into a land suffocating under English rule. His name, William Wallace. But no one could imagine that this child, born to a minor noble family in Elderslie, would one day ignite a fire so fierce it would shake the foundations of kings. His world was one of whispers and wounds. Whispers of betrayal, nobles bending their knees to Edward I Longshanks, a king feared across Europe, and wounds, raw scars in Scotland's soil from raids, hangings, and humiliation. William's father, Malcolm Wallace, was no great lord but a knight who believed in freedom. From him, young William learned the art of swordplay, horsemanship, and, most importantly, the belief that no man is born to chains. Yet it was tragedy that carved the boy into steel. When William was still young, his father was killed in one of the countless skirmishes with English forces. Loss in Scotland was a language every child understood. But for William, it was not just grief. It was a spark. Unlike many boys, William was educated, a rarity. He studied under monks, learned Latin, and devoured tales of Alexander the Great. This was not the brutish barbarian that later English propaganda painted him to be. Wallace was a thinker, a strategist, and a man who would fuse brain and brawn into one unbreakable weapon. But in those quiet years of study, he was already forming a vision. A land where Scots would not bow, would not be taxed into poverty, would not be treated as lesser beings in their own homeland. And then came the turning point. An English soldier insulted William's family, mocking their name, their claim to land. Wallace struck him down with brutal swiftness. It was small, personal, but it was the first time his rage spilled into blood, a foreshadowing of what was to come. Scotland was a tinderbox, and William Wallace was the flame. If you thought this was only the story of a boy's grief, wait until you see how that grief turned into Scotland's deadliest rebellion. Episode 2, The Chains of Edward Longshanks. Edward I of England, known as Longshanks, was not just tall in body but towering in ambition. He was ruthless, calculating, and determined to bring Scotland to heel. When Scotland's king died without an heir, Edward seized the moment. He installed his puppet, John Balliol, then stripped him of power, turning Scotland into a vassal state. For ordinary Scots, life became unbearable. Heavy taxes drained their land. English sheriffs demanded food and coin. Soldiers brutalized families, and worse, the infamous practice of prima nocta, though debated by historians, echoed in whispers, symbolizing the ultimate humiliation of Scottish women at the hands of English lords. Whether myth or truth, to the Scots it was a knife twisting in the heart. Wallace saw it all, but what broke him was not policy, it was personal. Marion Braveheart, the woman he loved, was murdered by English soldiers. Her death shattered the last of his restraint. In a fury, Wallace gathered a small band of men, struck back at English garrisons, and killed the sheriff responsible. It was no longer a feud, it was war. But here's the secret, Wallace didn't just fight, he inspired. In a land beaten down by fear, his defiance lit a torch. Farmers, peasants, and even disenfranchised nobles began to whisper his name. Wallace the outlaw, Wallace the avenger, Wallace the leader Scotland needed. Edward believed Scotland was broken. He had no idea that William Wallace had just risen. If you thought one man with a sword couldn't challenge an empire, the next chapter will make you question everything you thought you knew. Episode 3, The Rebellion Ignites. It began with raids. Wallace's men struck English convoys, freed prisoners, and destroyed strongholds. What made him dangerous wasn't brute force, it was unpredictability. Like a phantom, he would appear, strike, and vanish into the forests. His army grew not from wealth or noble command, but from faith. Faith in freedom. And then came Stirling Bridge, September 1297. Picture it, a narrow wooden bridge spanning the River Forth. On one side, thousands of English soldiers, armored and confident. On the other, Wallace and his ragtag army, outnumbered and outmatched. The English believed it would be a massacre. But Wallace waited, patient, watching. As the English crossed in small groups, trapped by the narrow bridge, he struck. His men surged, cutting them down before reinforcements could arrive. The bridge collapsed under chaos. Hundreds drowned, thousands were slaughtered. Against all odds, Wallace had defeated the most powerful army in the world. That day, he wasn't just a rebel. He became guardian of Scotland. But glory is never simple. Success brought enemies, not just English, but Scottish nobles jealous of his rise. And Edward Longshanks, he was enraged. This was no longer a rebellion, it was an insult. If Stirling Bridge shocked you, wait until you hear how Wallace's fate turned in the next battle. One that would change everything. Episode 4, The Weight of Betrayal. For a moment, Wallace stood tall. Guardian of Scotland, Victor of Stirling. His people sang his name. But victory has a cruel price. To feed his army, he imposed harsh demands on villages. To keep power, he needed the loyalty of nobles who despised him. And all the while, Edward Longshanks was preparing his response. At Falkirk, 1298, it came. Wallace faced an English army larger than anything Scotland had ever seen. His tactics, using schiltrons, tight formations of spears, initially held strong. English cavalry crashed and broke against the wall of spears. For a heartbeat, it seemed Wallace could do the impossible again. But betrayal struck. Key Scottish nobles abandoned the field, taking their forces with them. The schiltrons collapsed under waves of English arrows and cavalry. The battlefield turned into a slaughterhouse. Wallace escaped, but his army lay shattered. His guardianship ended. Once celebrated, Wallace now became a hunted fugitive. And Edward, he was merciless. He unleashed terror across Scotland, burning villages, hanging rebels, leaving corpses as warnings. Wallace had tasted glory, and now he tasted the ashes of betrayal. If you thought Wallace's story ended in defeat, the next part will reveal how a man broken by loss still found the strength to fight on. Episode 5, The Outlaw King. Stripped of title, hunted like an animal, Wallace refused to surrender. For years, he waged a guerrilla war, striking from the shadows, keeping Edward's forces on edge. He traveled across Europe, even reaching France, seeking alliances, pleading for aid. He knew Scotland couldn't stand alone forever. But his homeland was fracturing. Scottish nobles bickered for power. Some collaborated with the English for land and titles. Wallace's vision of a united Scotland was slipping through his fingers. Yet still men followed him. Not for riches, he had none to give. They followed because he embodied defiance itself. And here lies the little-known truth. Wallace wasn't fighting just for land. He was fighting for an idea. That no king, no empire had the right to strip people of their freedom. In an age of monarchs and serfs, this was radical. Dangerous, revolutionary, but danger brings betrayal. In 1305, Wallace was captured. Not by English hands at first, but by Scottish nobles who turned him over. The man who had defied the world was shackled, dragged south, and prepared for the cruelest fate imaginable. If you thought his battles were brutal, wait until you hear how the English tried to break not just his body, but his very spirit. Episode 6, Trial of a Rebel London, 1305. The heart of England pulsed with markets, nobles, and the steel of soldiers. But on one day, all eyes were fixed on a single prisoner dragged through its streets. William Wallace. Shackled, filthy from weeks in chains, yet unbowed. Crowds jeered, some in awe, others in hatred. To the English crown, this was a spectacle, a public display meant to crush Scotland's spirit once and for all. Wallace was accused of treason, but here is the bitter irony. He never swore loyalty to Edward I. His defiance was not treachery, but independence. When asked to confess, Wallace's voice rang out, "I could not be a traitor, for I was never his subject." Those words cut sharper than any blade. They turned his trial into theater, one where the accused made kings tremble. The sentence was merciless. Hanging, drawing, and quartering, the most brutal execution in medieval England. It wasn't just about killing Wallace. It was about obliterating his memory, scattering his remains to warn anyone who dared resist. Yet, even as they declared his fate, Wallace stood tall. Chains weighed down his body, but his eyes burned. He was more dangerous in defeat than many men in victory. If you thought that was grim, the next chapter reveals the horror of his execution, an ordeal so brutal it shocked even those who watched. Episode 7, The Martyr's End, August 23, 1305. The day William Wallace met his end. They dragged him through the streets of London, tied to horses, jeered by crowds. Every lash of the whip, every bruise from cobblestones was designed to strip him of dignity. But Wallace remained silent, his eyes fixed forward. At Smithfield, the executioners prepared their tools. He was hanged until nearly dead, then cut down, still breathing. His body was torn open, his organs ripped out before his eyes. His heart, his courage was burned. Finally, his body was cut into quarters, his head displayed on London Bridge, his limbs sent to the corners of England and Scotland. It was barbarity at its most theatrical. Yet, instead of erasing his legacy, it etched his name into eternity. Wallace's death was not just a punishment. It was a symbol. To the English crown, a warning. To the Scots, a martyr. Here's what's extraordinary. Despite the brutality, Wallace never begged for mercy. Not once. He faced death as he faced life, defiant, unbroken. And the people noticed. Stories of his courage spread like wildfire. Instead of silencing him, Edward had created a legend. If you thought his death ended the fight, wait until you see how Wallace's spirit carried forward into the wars that followed. Episode 8. The spark lives on Scotland did not die with Wallace. His martyrdom lit a fire that no execution could quench. Though Edward I believed he had crushed the rebellion, the truth was far different. In the Highlands and Lowlands, whispers of Wallace's defiance stirred hearts. Farmers told tales of the outlaw who defied kings. Soldiers remembered the victory at Stirling. Children grew up chanting his name. Then came Robert the Bruce. Once hesitant, even complicit with Edward, Bruce would eventually rise, taking Wallace's mantle. It is said Wallace's ghost haunted Scotland's conscience, reminding men what freedom demanded. When Bruce led his army at Bannockburn years later, he carried not just a crown but Wallace's spirit into battle. This is the little-known legacy. Wallace was not just a man of his age. He was a seed, and though he died brutally, that seed grew into Scotland's independence. Wallace fought with no kingdom behind him, no wealth to fund him, no crown to protect him. Only belief. And that belief became the foundation of a nation. If you thought Wallace's story was finished, wait until you hear the hidden truths and myths that blurred the line between history and legend. Episode 9. Fact and Legend. The Wallace we know today is not just history, it's myth, it's story, it's legend shaped across centuries. Chronicles written decades later turned him into a larger-than-life hero. The famous poem The Wallace by Blind Harry painted him as an unstoppable warrior, a man of destiny. But historians remind us, between fact and fable lies a vast shadow. Did Wallace really shout freedom? With his last breath, no record proves it. Did the English enforce prima nocta? Most likely not. And yet these tales persisted. Why? Because they carried truth beyond facts. They captured what Wallace symbolized, the raw fight for dignity, the refusal to kneel, the hunger for freedom. What's undeniable is that Wallace's actions were real. His victories were real. His sacrifice was real. And sometimes, myth is what keeps memory alive when facts fade. So the William Wallace remembered in ballads, stories, and even in the film Braveheart. He's both man and myth, warrior and symbol, history and legend intertwined. If you thought myth was powerful, wait until you hear how Wallace's name echoed not just in Scotland, but across the world centuries later. Episode 10. A voice beyond borders. Centuries after Wallace's death, his story still resonates. In the 18th century, during Scotland's struggles under British rule, his legend returned, reminding Scots of their ancestral fight for liberty. In the 19th century, when nationalism swept Europe, Wallace became a rallying cry, a reminder that even the oppressed could rise. And then far beyond Scotland, his name became universal. Freedom fighters in distant lands invoked Wallace as proof that one man could defy empires. His story inspired poets, revolutionaries, and even modern politicians who quoted his words, or the words attributed to him, as symbols of defiance. Wallace did not live to see independence, but his voice crossed centuries. He became more than a warrior. He became an idea. And that is why, to this day, people still whisper his name, not just in Scotland, but anywhere the fight for freedom burns. If you thought that was remarkable, wait until you hear how a Hollywood movie centuries later reshaped his legacy for the entire world. Episode 11. The shadow of Braveheart. Centuries passed, and William Wallace was remembered in ballads and folk tales. But in the late 20th century, one moment would resurrect his name for the entire world. 1995, and a Hollywood film, Braveheart. Mel Gibson's portrayal of Wallace was not history. It was myth turned into cinematic fire. The long blue war paint, the thundering cries of freedom, the sweeping romance and betrayal. It was not factually accurate, but it was emotionally true. It captured the essence of Wallace's defiance and made millions feel what it meant to resist oppression. The film swept the Oscars, won Best Picture, and made William Wallace a global icon. For many outside Scotland, Braveheart was their first introduction to him. And though historians groaned at inaccuracies, ordinary people felt something deeper, a story that spoke to their own struggles, their own hunger for liberty. That's the paradox of Wallace. His truth is both history and story, and Braveheart ensured that story would never die. If you thought Hollywood's version was powerful, wait until you hear how Scots themselves responded to Wallace's legend in modern times. Episode 12, Scotland's Guardian Reborn. For Scotland, Wallace's memory was never just entertainment. His legacy lived in stone. In Stirling stands the Wallace Monument, a towering structure rising above the land he once defended. Inside, artifacts like the Wallace sword, 5 feet of steel, enormous even by medieval standards, remind visitors of his might. Whether he truly wielded that exact sword or not, it doesn't matter. It represents him. Every year, Scots visit, climbing the spiral stairs, looking out across the same fields where Wallace stood against England. And for many, it's not just history, it's identity. Wallace embodies the soul of Scotland, the refusal to yield, the will to remain distinct, proud, and free. During debates about Scottish independence in recent decades, his name returned like a drumbeat. Politicians quoted him, activists carried his image. Wallace was no longer just a medieval figure. He was a living part of Scotland's voice. If you thought his influence was only national, wait until you see how his name inspired leaders and rebels across the globe. Episode 13, A Global Symbol of Resistance. Wallace was not unique in fighting for freedom, but what made him timeless was how his struggle echoed beyond Scotland. In the 19th century, revolutionaries in Europe invoked him in their battles against monarchies. In the 20th, leaders of independence movements across the world, places as far as India, Africa, and even the Americas, pointed to Wallace as proof that one man's courage could ignite nations. Here's a surprising truth. Wallace has been quoted in political speeches, memorialized in literature, and even studied in military academies for his guerrilla tactics. His name crosses borders. He belongs not just to Scotland, but to anyone who dreams of shaking off oppression. The very idea that a man without crown or riches could fight kings has become a universal story, and that is why Wallace's shadow falls across continents. If you thought the world embraced him, wait until you hear about the debates and controversies that his legacy still sparks today. Episode 14, Hero or Outlaw. Not everyone sees Wallace as a saint. To the English crown of his time, he was a criminal, a murderer, a rebel who defied law and order. Even today, some historians argue that his raids were brutal, his methods savage, his men guilty of the same cruelty they suffered. So who was he, hero or outlaw? The answer is both. Wallace lived in an age when war was ruthless, when mercy was rare, when rebellion demanded ferocity. To his enemies, he was a scourge. To his people, he was salvation. History rarely gives us clean heroes. Wallace was human, flawed, fiery, at times merciless. But perhaps that is what makes him real. His greatness was not perfection. It was the sheer will to rise, to fight, to never surrender even when the world turned against him. If you thought his humanity made him complicated, wait until you hear about the hidden personal side of Wallace that history rarely reveals. Episode 15, The Man Behind the Legend. Beneath the warrior, Wallace was still a man. He loved, he grieved, he dreamed. Stories of Marion Braidfute, whether legend or truth, remind us that his rebellion may have been born not just from politics, but from personal heartbreak. He wasn't driven by crowns or thrones. He had no desire to rule. He fought for the simple, profound belief that people deserved freedom in their own homes. He was educated, thoughtful, capable of strategy beyond brute force. He studied the art of war, but he also carried ideals rare for his time. Wallace wasn't a knight seeking glory. He wasn't a noble chasing power. He was something rarer, a leader who rose because he had to, not because he wanted to. And that's why his story endures. Because behind the legend of Braveheart, there was a man who chose to fight when others chose to kneel. If you thought seeing Wallace as a man was powerful, wait until you hear how his story reaches its crescendo in the final episodes, where his legacy becomes larger than life. Episode 16, Echoes in Stone and Song. Centuries after Wallace's death, his name refused to fade. Ballads were sung around fires, blending truth with poetry. Blind Harry's 15th century epic, The Wallace, gave him wings, turning his deeds into near myth. Whether every detail was true no longer mattered. The spirit was alive. Monuments began to rise. Most famously, the Wallace Monument at Stirling, completed in the 19th century. Standing tall above the landscape, it is less a tower of stone than a tower of memory. Within it lies the Wallace sword, nearly as tall as a man, a symbol of strength that defies centuries. To touch it is to feel history breathing. Even the land itself remembers him. The fields of Stirling Bridge, the rivers where men fought and died, the ruins of castles where Wallace once hid, all are silent witnesses to his defiance. Scotland built its nation not only with politics and wars, but with the stories carved into the hearts of its people. If you thought stone monuments were powerful, wait until you see how Wallace's memory was carried forward in fiery battles for identity and independence. Episode 17, Freedom's Drumbeat. Every nation needs symbols. For Scotland, Wallace became that heartbeat. In times of struggle, his name returned like a drum. During the Jacobite risings, rebels whispered his story. When Scotland was folded into the Union with England, his spirit remained a quiet rebellion. By the 19th century, nationalism surged. Writers, poets, and leaders seized Wallace's story as proof that Scotland was more than just a province. It was a people with a soul. Statues were raised, festivals held, school children taught to remember. Wallace became less a historical figure and more a national anthem, a human embodiment of the word freedom. And in the 20th and 21st centuries, during debates on Scottish independence, his name once again filled streets, speeches, and songs. Even when politics divided, Wallace united. He reminded people that freedom is never given, it is taken, defended, lived. If you thought national pride was his only gift, wait until you see how Wallace's fire crossed oceans and continents to inspire the world. Episode 18, Across the World. What makes William Wallace timeless is that he belongs to no single land. His struggle echoes wherever people rise against oppression. In revolutionary France, his name was invoked in pamphlets. In Ireland, poets compared their freedom fighters to him. In colonial revolutions across America and Africa, leaders cited Wallace as proof that empires could be resisted. Even today, his defiance inspires movements far beyond Scotland. Human rights groups, independence activists, even ordinary people standing against tyranny see Wallace not as a medieval relic, but as a symbol that one voice can thunder louder than armies. It is astonishing. A man without crown or wealth, hunted and executed as a traitor, now serves as a universal hero. His name, spoken in dozens of languages, is a torch passed from one generation to the next. If you thought global echoes were remarkable, wait until you see how his story still burns in modern culture through art, film, and passion that refuses to die. Episode 19, From Legend to Hollywood. The late 20th century gave Wallace a stage no medieval battlefield could match: cinema. Braveheart transformed him into a global phenomenon. Historians rolled their eyes at inaccuracies, the kilts, the blue paint, the fictional love affairs. Yet audiences wept, cheered, and felt his fight in their bones. The film wasn't history, it was mythology reborn. And sometimes myth is more powerful than fact. Millions left theaters repeating one word: freedom. For many, that word became tied forever to Wallace. This is the paradox. Hollywood distorted details but preserved the essence. It turned a medieval rebel into a modern icon, larger than life, a reminder that freedom is always worth bleeding for. And so William Wallace lives on, not just in dusty books, not just in Scotland's fields, but in the glow of screens across the globe, his story replayed for each new generation. If you thought Hollywood sealed his legacy, Wait until the final episode, where we uncover why Wallace still matters today and why his voice refuses to fade even after 700 years. Episode 20, The Eternal Flame of Freedom, William Wallace. A man born without crown, without wealth, without armies. A man who rose not because he sought glory, but because he could not endure chains. He fought. He bled. He sacrificed everything for one simple truth: that people deserve to live free. Yes, he lost battles. Yes, he died brutally. But his defeat was never final. His spirit outlived him. It fueled Robert the Bruce, carried into Bannockburn, carried into Scotland's independence. It grew into legend, etched in poems, monuments, and films. And now, centuries later, his name still sparks fire in hearts across the world. This is why Wallace matters, because he teaches us that freedom is not a gift. It is not handed down from kings or governments. It is earned, guarded, defended by those willing to stand when others kneel. His story is not just Scotland's, it is humanity's. And so when people whisper Wallace, they are not just remembering a man, they are remembering a truth. That one voice can echo louder than empires. That one life, however fragile, can change the destiny of nations. That even in death, courage does not die. If you find this video adding value to your life in any way, please take a moment and subscribe and like. And if you want to go further, write one word: value, because it helps with the algorithm so other people who need it can find it. It is free, and it's a way to give back to me. Please subscribe, like, and comment. Thank you.